He stood in the rain as the bodies swung from the overpasses, their legs moving in the cold wind like broken flags, and he held the photo of his wife and daughter pressed to his chest as the screens above the streets flickered with the face of the galactic dictator whose eyes were cold and empty as he announced that 90 million was only the beginning, and that those who remained alive would kneel or join them in the air. And he felt something in his mind crack like ice under a boot, as the rain soaked through his clothes and the ashes from the burning buildings mixed with the water and slid down his face, and he remembered the way his daughter used to laugh when she saw the rain, and the way she held out her hands to catch the drops, and he felt the heat of the tears that would not fall because he had none left to give to the sky, as he turned away from the rows of bodies to the silent streets, where the smell of burnt plastic and old blood filled the air, as the patrol drones floated by with their red lights, searching for those who were too afraid to bow. And he moved through the shadows with his boots, pressing into the wet ashes as he stepped past the cars that had been left in the roads, and the toys that were dropped when the soldiers came, and he saw the dogs that had no masters now sniffing at the gutters, as the wind howled between the buildings that once held laughter and light, and now held only the ghosts of what they were. And he reached the door of the old building where he had hidden the last can of food, and the last water filter that still worked, and he slipped inside, moving quietly up the broken stairs, as the rain dripped through the holes in the ceiling, and the flicker of lightning lit the walls with the handprints of children who would never run down these stairs again. And he reached the room where the radio waited wrapped in an old blanket, and he pulled it out with shaking hands, pressing the button to listen to the static and the broken voices whispering about the extinction protocol, about the code that would wake the old weapons that the earth had buried deep under the mountains and under the oceans and under the deserts. And he closed his eyes as he heard the voice of the woman who spoke through the static, telling those who were still alive that the time was coming to rise, that the blood of the 90 million would not be forgotten, that the dictator would pay. And he held the radio to his ear as he sank to the floor with the cold pressing into his bones as the rain fell harder and the thunder rolled above, and he whispered to the darkness that he would fight, that he would not let their deaths become nothing, that he would light the fire when the time came. And he pressed the photo of his family to his lips as he felt the promise in his chest, stronger than the fear, stronger than the hunger, stronger than the cold. And he closed his eyes for a moment in the darkness as the radio crackled with the promise of fire. She moved through the alleys with the broken glass crunching under her boots as the smoke from the burning buildings drifted through the morning light, turning it into a red haze that covered the world in a sick glow. As she kept her head down, under the hood she found in the ruins of a market where the shelves were empty and the floor was stained, dark and sticky. She passed the checkpoint where the soldiers in black armor stood with their rifles pointed at the ground as the patrol drones hovered above their heads with blinking red lights, scanning the people who moved past with empty eyes and empty hands. She tightened her grip on the small cloth bag she carried pressed against her chest, feeling the weight of the old data chip inside, the only piece of her brother that remained after the soldiers came and took him with the others. She remembered how he screamed for her to run as they dragged him away toward the square, where they hung those who refused to kneel, and she had run with her heart breaking with every step as she turned back once to see him lift his hand toward her before the rifle struck him down. She found the hidden tunnel under the old bakery, crawling through the dust and the darkness with the smell of mold and wet earth filling her lungs as the world above shook with the sounds of patrol ships tearing through the sky. She reached the room deep underground where the others waited, sitting in the shadows with their faces pale and eyes burning with the memory of what they had lost. She saw the old man who once fixed radios for the children, and the young mother who still wore the broken necklace of her daughter, and the boy who could not speak since the soldiers came. She stepped into the circle of light cast by the lantern in the center of the room and held up the cloth bag, her hands shaking as she unwrapped it to show them the data chip. The old man nodded slowly with tears in his eyes as he reached for the chip, holding it like it was a piece of his own heart as he turned toward the ancient terminal covered in dust and wires and screens that flickered with the symbols of the old world. She watched as the screen came alive, showing the codes, the protocols, the maps of the hidden weapons buried deep in the earth, waiting for the signal that would wake them, waiting for the day humanity would rise from its knees. And she felt the fear in her chest, but deeper than that she felt the fire, the promise that they would not let the dictator's laughter be the final sound in this world. She looked around the room at the others, who were watching the codes scrolling across the screen, and she saw the moment they felt it, to the shift from fear to purpose, the moment they remembered that the blood of 90 million demanded More than tears, it demanded fire, and she closed her eyes for a moment, whispering to her brother that she would keep the promise she made that day as the data chip began to upload into the system, as the extinction protocol began to breathe. He waited in the darkness of the tunnel, as the dust fell from the ceiling with every distant explosion above the world shaking under the boots of the soldiers who patrolled the ruined streets. As the cold air smelled of smoke and metal, he held the old rifle across his knees, the wooden stock worn smooth by the hands of those who carried it before him. His father, his uncle, the neighbor who once fixed broken doors, and he thought of the day they came, the soldiers in black armor dragging people into the square, forcing them to kneel, as the patrol ships hovered above with their red lights flashing across the faces of those who wept, and those who were silent, and those who begged for mercy. And he remembered the screams when the dictator appeared on the giant screens, his voice cold as he read the names of those who would hang today, the names of people he once played with as a child, people who once shared bread and stories under the stars, people who once believed they would see the future. And he felt the weight of the rifle as he pressed it against his chest, whispering to himself that he would not be next, that if he had to die he would not die on his knees, he would die fighting for the voices that were silenced. He moved through the tunnel as the sounds of boots and engines rumbled above, the walls shaking as dust fell into his hair and onto the rifle. As he passed the place where the water dripped from a broken pipe, forming a small pool that reflected the dim light of the lantern he carried, he saw his reflection and did not recognize the hollow eyes, the dirt covering his face, the sharpness in his jaw. That came from hunger, and he looked into those eyes and promised himself that he would become the fire they needed, that he would light the spark that would call the old weapons to life. As the extinction protocol waited, like a heartbeat in the earth, waiting for the moment to rise, he reached the end of the tunnel, where the ladder led to the broken streets above, and he climbed slowly, the cold metal biting into his hands as the sounds of the patrol ships grew louder with each step. He reached the top, pushing open the rusted hatch and sliding out into the shadows of a burned building, where the wind carried the ashes of those who died in silence. He moved quickly through the alley with the rifle held close as he passed the places where bofties still hung in the cold air, turning slowly with the breeze, and he whispered to them that he would not forget, that he would make them remember that the fire was coming. He reached the building where the old transmitter was hidden behind a false wall, where the signals for the protocol could be sent to the waiting satellites, where the call for vengeance would echo through the dark sky. And he took a breath, closing his eyes as he pressed his hand against the cold metal of the transmitter, feeling it come alive under his touch as the lights blinked once, then twice, then held steady, and he opened his eyes, whispering to the ashes that the time had come to speak back in fire. She stood in the small room, hidden beneath the burned library, where the books had turned to ash long ago, where the stories of those who came before were nothing but dust in the wind. And she felt the silence pressing against her skin as she stared at the screen in front of her, where the codes from the data chip were flowing like rivers of light across the darkness. She could hear the echo of her daughter's laughter in her mind, the way she used to hold the child close as the wind rattled the windows, the way she promised her that the world would be safe, that she would grow up and see the stars without fear. And she remembered the day the soldiers came, how they kicked down the door, how they took her daughter from her arms, how they left her lying in the dirt with blood in her mouth and the sound of boots fading into the distance. And she remembered the screams that followed her into her nightmares, the silence that came after when she found her daughter's necklace broken in the dirt outside the square where the bodies were hung, and the screens showed the dictator's face as he smiled with dead eyes and promised peace through fear. She closed her eyes as she reached into her pocket, pulling out the broken necklace, pressing it to her lips as she whispered to her daughter that it was time, that the promise she made would be kept, that the fire would come and the dictator would fall. She placed the necklace on the console next to the screen as the codes continued to scroll, and she reached for the keyboard with hands that shook from hunger and cold, but not from fear anymore. The fear was gone, burned away by the memory of the screams and the silence. She began to type, entering the final sequence that would connect the hidden transmitters to the satellites above, the ones buried in the ashes of old wars, waiting for the day they would be called again. She felt the vibration in the floor as the old generators came alive, as the hum of power filled the air like a distant storm, as the screen flickered and showed the signal reaching up into the black sky, carrying the codes of extinction protocol like a torch in the dark. She pressed her hand against the screen as the tears finally came, not for herself but for the child who would never see the dawn, for the millions who swung in the cold wind, for the voices that were silenced by the dictator's madness. She watched as the final confirmation appeared on the screen, as the system acknowledged her command, as the weapons buried under mountains, under oceans, under the broken cities, opened their eyes for the first time in years, and she whispered that it was time for them to speak, that it was time for the dictator to learn what it meant, to steal hope from those who had nothing left to lose, and she took the necklace once more, placing it around her neck as she turned away from the screen, stepping into the shadows of the tunnel, knowing that the fire had been lit, that the world would remember, that humanity would speak back in the only language the dictator would understand. He moved through the city with the cold air cutting against his skin, as the fires from the riots burned in the distance, lighting the broken towers with an angry glow, and he kept the rifle close to his chest as he stepped over the shattered glass, and the empty shells that rattled under his boots. With every step he saw the faces of the patrol drones drifting through the smoke, their red lights searching for signs of life, scanning the alleys where the wind carried the smell of burned cloth and oil. He remembered the old man who gave him the rifle, the way his hands shook as he placed it in his arms, whispering that it was time, that the moment had come when silence was no longer enough, when the ashes of the dead demanded something louder, something stronger than tears. He passed the place where the children used to play, the walls now black with fire, the swings moving with the cold breeze like ghosts waiting for the laughter to return, and he felt the promise in his chest, the promise that it would not end this way, that the world would not belong to the dictator, who watched from the screens with dead eyes and a cold smile. As he counted the dead-like trophies, he moved into the subway tunnels, where the air was damp and heavy with the scent of rust and mold, where the darkness wrapped around him like a second skin. He found them there, the others who refused to kneel, the others who carried the fire in their eyes and the memory of the voices that were taken from them. They looked at him as he entered with the rifle in his hands, and they nodded because they all knew what was coming. They all knew that the extinction protocol had been awakened, that the hidden weapons were no longer sleeping, that the satellites above were waiting for the signal that would call down the fire, that would tear apart the machines of the dictator. They gathered around the old table in the corner, where the lantern flickered, casting their shadows on the cracked tiles, as they spread out the maps showing the locations of the transmitters, the positions of the patrols, the places where the hidden bunkers waited with supplies for those who would fight. He saw the young woman who had lost her sister, the boy who had lost his voice, the mother who wore the broken necklace around her neck, and he felt their pain as if it was his own, felt it turning into something sharp, something unbreakable, as they placed their hands on the map one by one, swearing that they would see this through, swearing that the dictator would fall, that the voices of the 90 million would not be forgotten. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the cold air as he felt the fear in his chest trying to rise, but it was drowned by the fire that was stronger than fear. He opened his eyes, looking at the others as he lifted the rifle, and they lifted theirs, and they knew that it was time, that the fire was ready to speak, that the world would remember, that humanity would not bow. And they moved together into the tunnels, stepping into the darkness with the promise that they would light the dawn with fire. She climbed the stairwell of the crumbling building with the rifle slung across her back, and the cold wind cutting through the holes in the walls, as the sky above was a dark canvas of clouds hiding the satellites that watched in silence. She could see the fires burning in the distance, where the people were rising, tearing down the statues of the dictator, dragging the metal symbols of his power through the streets, as the patrol drones circled overhead trying to contain the fury. But the fury had grown too large to hold back. The voices of the 90 million were in every scream and every cry that rose into the cold air. As the ashes of the dead mixed with the smoke of the burning towers, she reached the top of the building, where the old transmitter dish was hidden beneath tarps and broken metal, waiting for the moment it would be called upon to speak. She removed the cover with shaking hands, her breath forming white clouds in the cold as she connected the wires to the small power cell they had risked everything to find. She could hear the distant sounds of gunfire in the streets below, the sharp cracks echoing against the broken walls. The people were fighting back with stolen rifles, with homemade bombs, with the memory of those who were taken from them, with the promise of the fire that was coming. She turned on the transmitter, watching as the small lights flickered to life, as the screen showed the connection to the satellites above, waiting for the final code that would awaken the weapons buried in the mountains and the deserts and the oceans, the weapons that would speak for those who could no longer speak. She remembered her sister, the way she used to sing when the nights were long, the way she held her hand when the soldiers came and dragged her away, the way she looked back one last time before disappearing into the darkness, and she felt the tears on her face cold as they fell, but she let them fall as she pressed the final sequence into the console, her hands steady, even as her heart pounded like a drum in the silence. She could hear the voices of the others through the radio, fragments of promises, fragments of prayers, fragments of fury, and she closed her eyes, whispering to her sister that it was done, that the dictator would learn, that the world would learn, that humanity would not remain silent. She opened her eyes as the screen turned green, showing that the signal was sent, showing that the satellites were aligned, that the extinction protocol was breathing alive in the dark sky. She felt the vibration in the ground as the old weapons deep beneath the earth began to awaken. The cold metal hearts beating for the first time in years, ready to speak the language of fire. She stood there with the wind tearing at her hair and the cold pressing against her skin as she watched the sky, waiting for the moment the fire would fall, waiting for the world to remember that humanity would never be broken, that the ashes of the dead would not be forgotten, that the dawn would come in flames. He stood in the middle of the abandoned street with the sky above him turning from gray to a deep red as the clouds burned from the glow of the cities on fire far away, and he could feel the rumble beneath his boots as the earth began to tremble. With the awakening of the weapons buried deep below the weapons they had sworn to keep hidden, the weapons they now called upon to speak for the 90 million who could no longer speak. He looked around him and saw the others stepping out of the shadows of the broken buildings, each carrying the weight of the promise they had made to the fallen, each carrying the memory of the screams and the silence that followed, each carrying the fire in their eyes that would not be put out by fear or by the cold. They moved together without speaking as the patrol drones flew overhead, their red lights scanning the streets, unable to understand that it was already too late, that the people they had tried to break were no longer afraid, that the silence they forced upon the world was already shattered. He felt the rifle in his hands, heavy and cold, but it was not as heavy as the memory of the bodies swinging from the metal beams in the square, not as heavy as the sound of his mother's voice begging the soldiers to let her child go, not as heavy as the promise he had made to himself as he stood in the ashes of his home, that he would see the dictator fall, that he would see the statues torn down and the screens go black, and the voice that commanded death would be silenced. He looked up as the first light broke through the clouds, a single line of burning white that split the sky as the satellites answered the call of the extinction protocol, as the old weapons locked onto the signals that were now flooding the network sent from the transmitters they had activated one by one across the burning cities. He felt the heat against his skin as the air began to vibrate, the sound deep and rising like a storm that had no end, and he saw the others looking up as well, their faces lit by the glow of the dawn that was not made by the sun but by the fire they had called upon to speak. He thought of his father, who once told him that the world could be beautiful again, that the stars would belong to the people if they were brave enough to claim them, and he whispered to the wind that they were ready, that they were not afraid, that the dawn of fire was their answer to the darkness and the cold silence the dictator had forced upon them. He raised his rifle into the air as the fire fell from the sky, as the towers of the oppressors were engulfed in light, as the ground shook with the promise that the 90 million were not forgotten, that the ashes were not the end, that the dawn was theirs, and he felt the tears on his face as the light reflected in his eyes, whispering to himself that they had finally spoken back in the only language the dictator would understand. She stood at the edge of the crater, where the old command tower once reached into the sky with its black glass and cold steel, where the dictator's voice once echoed across the screens that glowed in every street and every room, reminding them of their place, reminding them of the fear they were meant to carry in their bones. She stood there as the wind blew ash and dust across her boots, as the ground was still warm from the fire that had fallen from the sky, as the extinction protocol spoke in light and heat and thunder. She remembered the day they took her father, the way he held her hand until the last moment, the way he told her to be brave, the way he promised that the dawn would come one day if enough of them believed. And now, as she looked across the smoking ruins, she felt that promise in her blood, stronger than the cold, stronger than the fear that once wrapped around her chest and made it hard to breathe. She could see the others standing with her along the rim of the crater, some with rifles still in their hands, some with tears on their cheeks, some with nothing left but the will to witness the end of the voice that commanded the hangings, the end of the eyes that watched from the screens and judged them without mercy. She could see the burned fragments of the screens scattered in the rubble like black snow, reflecting the dawn that had come, not with gentle light but with the roar of the sky opening and pouring fire on the machines of the dictator. The patrolled drones that once circled above were now twisted metals scattered in the streets. Below, the towers that once held the speakers that announced the names of the condemned were now shattered bones of steel and glass, and she felt the ground beneath her feet trembling still as the old weapons returned to silence. Their purpose fulfilled for now, she knelt and picked up a small piece of glass, holding it up to the dawn, watching the firelight dance across its jagged edges, and in that moment she saw her reflection, and it was not the face of the frightened child who once hid under the floorboards. When the soldiers came, it was not the face of the silent girl who watched as her father was dragged away. It was the face of the dawn, itself the face of the fire. They had become the fire that would not be extinguished even when the ashes settled and the silence tried to return. She closed her eyes and whispered to her father that they had done it, that the dictator's tower was no more, that the world would remember, that the 90 million would not be forgotten. She stood again, as the wind blew against her face, carrying the scent of smoke and freedom, and she looked to the others, nodding to them because they knew this was not the end. They knew the world would need to be rebuilt. They knew there would be more battles to come, but for this moment, they had spoken back in fire, and the dawn belonged to them. He walked through the silent streets where the ashes still fell like soft snow, and the burned air carried the last whispers of the screams that once echoed between the broken walls, and he could see the outlines of the people who were slowly stepping out from the shadows, from the basements, from the tunnels, where they had hidden, waiting for the fire to speak, waiting for the sky to answer the prayers they whispered to the darkness. He saw the mother with her child pressed against her chest, the tears on her face carving lines through the soot, as she looked at the dawn that was rising, not with the gentle warmth of peace, but with the sharp heat of freedom. He saw the old man, who carried the photo of his son, who was taken by the soldiers, and never returned. He saw the young girl holding a piece of metal shaped like a star, reminding herself that even the coldest nights would one day give way to light. He kept moving with his rifle slung across his back, the same rifle he had used to fight in the alleys and on the rooftops, the same rifle that had become a part of him as he became a part of the fight. He moved past the fallen statues of the dictator, where the face that once smiled with hollow eyes now lay cracked and broken on the ground, and he felt nothing for the face, only for the people who had suffered under its shadow, only for the voices of the 90 million that were finally free to rise with the wind. He reached the square where they once gathered the condemned, and he stood there as the sun broke through the smoke and touched the ground that had been stained with the blood of the innocent. He saw the others gathering around him, some with scars on their faces, some with tears in their eyes, some holding the hands of those they loved, and for a moment the world was silent, not with the fear that the dictator demanded, but with the breath of a world that was learning how to live again. He knelt and placed his hand on the cold ground, whispering to the 90 million that they were not forgotten, whispering that the fire they had called was not the end but the beginning, that the dawn would not be wasted, that the ashes would be the soil from which a new world would grow. He stood and looked at the others, and they looked back at him, and in their eyes he saw the promise that they would build something worth the sacrifice, something worth the ashes, something worth the screams that had once filled the night. They turned together and began to walk away from the square, leaving behind the broken symbols of the dictator, leaving behind the silence that once held them down, carrying with them the fire that would guide them through the dark, carrying with them the promise that humanity would not bow again. And as the wind lifted the ashes into the dawn light, he whispered to the fallen that the world would remember that the fire they had unleashed was the promise that humanity would rise and speak forever.